Now live. So before I begin on this very, very, very special night here in Sydney and day in Johannesburg, and I believe we have people in the UK, and I believe we have people in the US. So it's quite interestingly and nicely global. Let me just make sure. Yeah, my sound is off there. So I'd like to just do acknowledge the fact that I am doing my part of the presentation from Sydney, which is Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, of the indigenous people here in Australia. And it's a great, it's always something that's a great privilege to, and just to be cognizant of is this where we're doing these things from. And also just to realize that probably the first artists and scientists were people of this land many, many years ago. So it's a great privilege to be able to do this from here. Now, I think we have a new audience tonight, so I'd like to just introduce myself. I'm Steven Durbach. I go with the pseudonym Sid Sledge that came up a while ago, and it seems to never have left me. So I'm both Steven Durbach and Sid Sledge. And maybe that's because I was once a scientist many years ago, together with one of the panelists here, Bavesh Kana. And about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I moved over to the arts full time. And was really hoping to forget all about science. I thought I'd had my time with science, but after working as an artist, trying just to understand color, line, form, I basically went over to the arts full time. And it should be live. Can't see. All right. So that's just, sorry, one sec. You say you can't see it on YouTube? Give it a minute. Just give it a minute. Okay, I think it takes a couple of minutes to go live to YouTube. So yes, I've been working as an artist for some time, and then quite unexpectedly, and I suppose you can't escape your past. I just through art discovered the beauty of science. Through just doodling one day, all these beautiful ideas came into my drawings, and I realized in that moment I felt a bit evangelical about it. I felt that science was really beautiful and had much to teach us, and it reminded me of why I went into the science in the first place. Like when so it was and ever since then, I've really been trying to bring art and science together. It's a real passion of mine, where I've been working with science institutions at UNSW, University of New South Wales, other organizations, the CSIRO, trying just to they gracefully allowed me to do my artistic experiments in their laboratories, which was a huge privilege. But then I've come to realize, one of the things we were hoping to do was at the CSIRO is start what we call the Art Research Laboratory. But a certain virus, COVID, came along and sort of scuppered those plans. So in lieu of that, I launched this Coffee in the Studio program, because I thought it's a great opportunity to launch like an online event where we actually just have artists and scientists in conversation. And we've done a few of these, and the thing I've realized is that they're actually not so much conversations as they are encounters, because the worlds that artists and scientists come from seem to be so different. And what has been beautiful, I think, has been the openness with which both the artists and the scientists have come to these encounters and shared their experience, knowing that they're actually entering quite an uncertain space where we don't know what's going to happen. And I think that makes it quite a beautiful thing. And I just want to say one thing about the Zoom context. I have to just share this photograph, because I was doing one of these Zooms from a gallery, and I just got to find this particular image. Yes, it's this image here. So I was doing a Zoom from the gallery, and my wife took a photograph of me, and I saw the photograph later, and I was like, I thought I was having this intense conversation with people, but if you look at the photograph, I'm literally just sitting in front of my screen. To me, it was the strangest thing. So there I was having an intense conversation with people, and I thought I was in that conversation. I thought I was in the room with these people. But looking at this photograph, besides the fact that my back is very hunched over, I'm actually just sitting in front of my screen, staring at the screen. So it seemed very peculiar. And then I realized there's something quite profound about that. We were having a conversation in time, but the space of that conversation is actually very, very uncertain. It's discontinuous for one thing. We're in 3 different places, but yet, and we don't quite know where anything is in the cloud. And it made me realize there's an uncertainty there. There's a spatial uncertainty. And that talks to ideas of quantum physics, but it also, I think, talks to that really interesting space between art and science, which really made me think maybe Zoom is a great way to actually have these encounters, to accept, once we accept that fact. So I'll just stop sharing that image. So now I really just want to, first of all, welcome the audience. Like, I'm not sure who is out there, but I do believe there are people watching this. And I want to welcome you from wherever you are. And if you have any questions you want to ask, please just type them onto the YouTube link. And my charming assistant in the corner there is going to just let me know what they are. And then without further ado, like, I just have to now, talk about the wonderful people who have joined me, the wonderful guests I have. I'm going to start with Bavesh, because Bavesh and I actually have a long history together. We worked in a laboratory in Johannesburg studying mycobacteria, the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, and did our PhDs at more or less the same time. And Bavesh, I left science fairly shortly after having worked at the University of the Witwatersrand in 2008. I left and came to Australia. But Bavesh, what amazed me about the direction he took, he was a laboratory-based scientist and still is. But Bavesh recognized that part of what he wanted to do was reach, he felt there was a compassion lacking in the research he was doing. So he was studying in the laboratory with the test tubes and all that, but he never really knew what it was like to suffer from tuberculosis. So I think, and Bavesh, I'm sure we'll talk about that, is that he made it part of his mission to actually reach out into that world and bring compassion and humanity into his science. So Bavesh has already crossed that bridge over from science into something else, which I think is a great thing. Just to, he's also, besides that, is a highly, highly regarded scientist in South Africa. He's the director of the NRF, DSI NRF Center of Excellence for Biomedical TB Research. I'm not going to run through all of his accolades because there are many. He's also one of the, he's an early career scientist for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is a great honor, one of 700 chosen. And he's also in the Mail and Guardian, which is a South African newspaper, a very influential newspaper. He's in the top 200 of the young, influential South Africans. So, I mean, a lot's happened since I last saw you, Bavesh, in the flesh, so to speak. But to say that your trajectory has not been stellar, it's quite remarkable to see where you've gone. Now, that brings me now to our, I'm very starstruck tonight because I have with me William Kentridge, yes, which is an extraordinary honor, and I'm deeply grateful for him for doing this. And I'd love to hear from him actually when we start talking why he wants to talk to scientists, why that is of interest to him. But before I open it up to my panelists here, I do want to say something about William. Now, I didn't know anything about art growing up. I didn't think about art. And then one day, I think it was 1989, 1990 or thereabouts, someone showed me an image, or I got to see this image. I'm just going to share it. Bear with me here. This image here. Can you all see that? So that is one of the first. So this is a drawing. William, do you recognize that drawing?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. So it's a drawing called Casper's Full of Love, and it was the first. And this drawing referred to the situation in South Africa during that. This was during the height of apartheid, when there were, great atrocities being done to African people in South Africa. It was a very oppressive time, and how the society engaged with it was always a challenge. And it was generally kept away from you. But art and William's work showed me for the first time that art can actually really say something about society in a very confronting yet strangely beautiful way. So William, you may be responsible for my departure in some sense from the sciences into the arts, and well, I think I'm grateful to you for that. So that's
maybe not so grateful. Yes.
So having said that, so there's that powerful image, and William's work has a lot to do with trying to understand meaning. right? Trying to understand how we find meaning in our world. I'm not an art critic, all right? So I don't want to go into a heavy art critic thing here. But what I do want to say is a lot of this conversation, I think, is going to be about what meaning means. What does it mean to measure? You know, these kind of ideas. And also, obviously, living in South Africa with a huge disease burden, COVID's clearly, it may well come up in the conversation too. So maybe I can ask you, William, just to kick it off. Why do you want to talk to scientists? Where does that get you?
Well, I'm very interested to talk to Bavesh specifically, but science in general, in the broader sense. I think that one normally thinks of science as about empirical measurement and a very dry field. But my experience has been that behind every scientific question, there are a number of non-scientific metaphors. And the way in which science releases metaphors that relate to other elements of our life in very direct ways. And so it's not a sense of trying to understand the deep science or the mathematics of the science, but to understand some of the real questions. Just to give one example, there was a debate until maybe a year or so ago, with cosmologists, with scientists of black holes. And this was a debate about whether a black hole that has such a massive gravity that it absorbs all the light and won't release light out from inside it, whether that was so great that everything that approached a black hole would be swallowed by it, never to be seen again. And some scientists said, yes, it would disappear completely into a black hole. The others said, and it's always posed as a debate about throwing an encyclopedia into a black hole. And so here again, one understands, yes, it's a scientific question, but it's already posed in something that you do in the studio where you might literally throw an encyclopedia over your shoulder. So it already invites a material to think about the question. And some scientists said, no, if an encyclopedia gets thrown into the black hole, then if everything is absorbed, it breaks the laws of entropy and thermodynamics. So what we have to believe is that in some form, as the encyclopedia approaches the black hole, all the information, in this case, say the words, the entries, but all the knowledge can't get swallowed. It has to remain around the edge of the black hole as strings of information completely dissolved, but theoretically reclaimable, to not break other laws of entropy. And this is on the one hand a scientific debate, and there's a huge mathematics about what exactly happened. The Stephen Hawkins and the others would be directly involved. But what it is also about, it's about the need for different scientists to have different beliefs. And of course, the central metaphor of the black hole, or one of the central metaphors of the term the black hole, is the black hole we all head into, our own black hole of our own graves. And so it becomes a debate about, if you go into your black hole of your grave, is that the end? Is nothing left? Is that finished cloud done? Or do we need to believe that there's some emanation, some trace of ourselves that still does, which in poetic terms would be a kind of soul? So you think you're talking about pure science, but in fact, very soon you're talking about very different places. And then you can support arguments with different mathematics, but it's also, and there may well be a clear answer of that in the end, but the kind of images that debate releases is where it joins into what charges one in the studio. What is it, the energy that gives to be making other images, to be thinking about questions which are about mortality, our relationship towards fate, our belief that we're going to survive in the memory of other people or other things that we've left behind. So sorry, that was a long explanation of why science has been a very rich provocation for work in the studio to find a different approach to the same questions they're looking at.
So Bavesh, I mean, so there you are in the lab, doing your, digging deeply into quite specific problems. Does what William says, does that resonate? Does that resonate to have a story or some kind of metaphor for you to engage with the science that you specifically do, or even made you become a scientist in the first place?
Yeah, Stephen. In fact, I'm so glad William made those comments, because they frame my particular view of science quite well. So just maybe just for context, I think by far and large we should dispel with this image of scientists as these people in lab coats locked behind doors in laboratories trying to answer very, very specific or ethereal questions, right? Science, and especially science today, it's very much it's a human endeavor. The journey of science it's very much a human thing and driven by the human spirit. It requires a lot of resilience. You've got to, it's not an easy road. You've got to apply for grant funding. You usually have to apply for many grants before you get one. So you really have to believe in what you're doing. That's the first thing. Then, when you have the opportunity to do some science, how you pose your question, that again, that is, that's really where I think the creative and artistic element of science comes out, because you have a problem. And as you see today with COVID, for example, it can be approached in so many different ways. And as William has mentioned, you can have so many conflicting, yet and divergent views that can coexist at the same time, both seemingly being the truth. So how you pose your question is also very much a humanitarian and artistic endeavor. And then going about answering the question. And as we see again with COVID, nature can be very uncooperative sometimes. So, you don't get the answers you seek, or things look very different. You've got to go back and reformulate. And I love the idea of the encyclopedia hitting the accretion disk, right? You have to say, okay, this is what I thought was going to happen, but this is what the measurement is saying. And that's not what's happening. So I've got to go back and reformulate. A lot of that is, it's a journey into yourself as a scientist. How do you look at this problem? How plastic are you in your views? Are you open to, embracing a view that was completely different to what you started with? And then there's, there's the idea that whatever you do is under immense scrutiny, right? So once you have the science, you've gone through this journey, you have a set of observations and you want to publish them or put them out into the scientific society, you go through this baptism of fire, of peer review. People tell you whether they think it's right, whether they think it's wrong, whether they believe you, whether they don't believe you. See, it's a very intensely personal journey. And, scientists are intensely, committed to these processes in order to achieve any kind of successful science. So, and that's my first take. But to further frame, the comments William made regarding different views, I think the thing about science, which is so beautiful and yet scary, is that we know less and less, and again, let's take COVID, for example. We think so many things would play out in a certain way and they don't. But we do know pockets of information, yet there's more out there that we don't know than what we do know. So I think also accepting that, it's very humbling, but also understanding, how do you find a space in this big unknown, to create some meaning and create connections. I think that is also very much a part of the scientific endeavor.
I actually love the way you said meanings and connections, because it is a kind of storytelling. So I thought maybe what would be interesting to look at is, you both, so you do your work, you see the world in a laboratory. That's how you get your world. I think it's fair to say, Bavesh, through your measurement, through your very specific apparatus, you develop a world view of the organism that you're studying, the problem that you're trying to solve. And because it's quite hard to get at what you're thinking, but the place where you do your thinking, I think, is a really interesting way to look at how an artist works. So there we have William in your studio, and it seems that much of your process is your metaphors are so tightly coupled to your actual mechanism of working. So you see your metaphors tightly coupled to your actual process. So can you tell us how a worldview can be shaped or evolved in a studio, in your case, William? And then Bavesh, I'd love to see if you can respond to that, about what kind of worldview can you get in a laboratory? How does that shape your worldview?
So I think that the key thing is that any question or any theme or any topic or any body of work that one's working with, there always needs to be a meeting of something from outside the studio, questions of black holes, of death, of graves, of souls. There has to be a theme that you're thinking about, but then you have to find a material in the studio with which to think about it. So to give another scientific example, a project that was never done was when they were first investigating the speed of light, and scientists in the 19th century were discovering that the speed of light was specific, not infinite, not infinitely fast. Images took a finite time to travel from one place to another. There was a scientist who then said, if you extrapolate from that, you can say that every image, everything that's ever happened on Earth, that image is traveling outwards from Earth at the speed of light. And that's what you know. We know we're seeing a light from a star 6 billion years ago. We're seeing its projection 6 billion years later, and it's now reached us. But he said, if you took that theoretically, obviously allowing for perfect optics and everything, if you're in the right space away from Earth, you could see all the events that had happened on Earth at different times. He placed it in religious terms. He said, if you were 2,000 light years away or 1,900 light years away from Earth, you could still see the crucifixion, and you could see Pontius Pilate washing his hands. All of these events were still somewhere traveling out from the Earth, as we know, like a gravitational collapse of two black holes reaches us millions of years later. But what that suggested in the studio was this huge archive of images, which I would have been projecting on the ceiling, this idea of everything, a universal archive of what had happened on Earth, are these images floating away from us. So the idea of both a projection above us and different images, a range of images, and maybe you need a mirror to look at those images which are on the ceiling above you. So then you think, well, maybe you've got to turn the writing, if you have writing, into mirror writing so you can only read it. And then you think, is that like the cloud of the internet, which comes down to an individual, instead of a mirror, it comes down to your iPad or a phone, all that information. So all of those things are released by this report, the scientific report of this 19th century experiment to measure the speed of light. So it's not trying to do a piece about the speed of light, but about all the things that are released by it. So in that sense, the studio, which has the canvas, the charcoal, the video camera, the projectors, space for performers to move, becomes the terrain in which the world can be brought in as this piece of information, as the story about the speed of light, dismantled, changed into different material, and then sent back out into the world as a video projection, a drawing, a film, or a conversation like this. So for me, the studio as a thinking and making space is vital.
Wonderful. Do you mind if I just refer to a comment that's been put up by one of the audience members, Professor Himla Sujal, who's the director of the South African Academy of Science, I believe, says that science and art are expressions of our cognitive abilities linked with interpretation, which I think is a really nice way to frame actually this conversation. Thanks, William. So yeah, and Bavesh, how does that, so when you hear that about, the view of the world being informed by what's in front of you in the laboratory, in the studio, in William's case, how do you shape your view of the bacteria, let's say, or the disease that you're studying by what's available to you in the laboratory? Do you imagine it first and then try and see what you've got in the lab to help you develop the story? Or do you see what's available to you in the laboratory and then and then let that inform your imagination about what you're dealing with?
I think it's a bit of both, right, Steve? So the really interesting thing about science these days is it sits at this cusp of the past and the future. So when we try to frame, to use your words, a worldview of a problem, right? So the conventional way of doing this is that there's just so much information out there. And the electronic connectivity of information that was, previously cataloged as papers, as physical journals, really allows very rapid and easy access to what's been done. So let's say we want to frame a problem. We start off by saying, well, what's been done? So that's the past, right? We go back as far as we can go back and we say, what do we know, right? The next is, what are people doing? So what are people doing on this problem? And that's really where you get this connectivity through the internet, through electronic media, through Facebook, through people's web pages. You can get a very good sense of what people are doing. Then you frame that, you use that, and you can compress the entire world of scientific information on a particular subject into a set of questions. You then frame those questions and you think, okay, how are these going to play out? right? So what do I need to do this? And that's you go out, like you would go into your studio and you would say, what tools do we have immediately available? What are the tools we have available here in our lab? What can we use to answer questions? But again, the wonderful connectivity that's developed over science, the last few decades, also allows you to reach out to people to say, do you want to help? Do you want to work on this common problem? There are some things you can do that we can't do. And you create a little community, a global community around this scientific problem, and you move forward all together. So that's how we develop and cultivate a worldview on particular scientific topics these days.
Yeah, and specifically the actual tools, the actual apparatus you use, like the graphs, the way you have to separate DNA from each other on a gel, the way you visualize proteins. I think what William has done here is give incredible metaphors for how we can engage with ideas. But when you're looking at data, you're not looking at the thing itself. You're looking at a abstraction of it. And you're trying to put a narrative through that. Do you think that gives I guess what I'm trying to ask is how much of your own interpretation is going to inform that your view of what the microbial, in your case, of what the disease actually looks like, and yeah, if you can, does that question make sense? Like what?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do it all the time. Because what we study is so small, it's not visible to the naked eye. A lot of our life is about surrogates, right? We measure something, and that means this for the bacterium. We separate out, as you say, we separate out DNA, and that allows us to look at particular unique elements of a DNA sequence within an organism, right? But we can't look at the physical DNA, right? So the entire scientific enterprise is an enterprise of metaphors, right? Of comparisons, of surrogates. But I suppose, in order to build a certain degree of credibility, what scientists have done from time immemorial is to build benchmarks. That, okay, if I'm saying this is my metaphor, I see this in the DNA, it actually is there, and here's my evidence for it. And the best type of evidence is I see a gene for blue eye color, and the person has blue eye color. That type of thing, but we don't actually physically see the gene. It's an entire metaphor. And that goes to every aspect of science we study, right? So we study, for example, how bacteria and viruses respond to antibiotics. Why is it that we have to treat people for so long? We can't see the bacteria dying in people. So we, again, draw a surrogate that there are probably some bacteria there that don't die very easily. And we have to treat for longer. Now you frame this potential picture of what you think is going on, and then you try to draw metaphors. How do we measure that? How do we develop a surrogate for these organisms that refuse to die? So a lot of it is very metaphorical, but I think in order for us to create some order, which is what the nature of science demands, is that there's a lot of benchmarking that occurs in that exercise.
Yeah, a lot of simplification and abstraction. Do you think, William? Do you think, like, if we talk about the history of art a little bit, because in science a lot of abstraction has to happen, and do you think the development of abstraction in art, and I know your art's not, I would say it's not very abstract, but do you think that had a big influence on the way we think currently now in terms of engaging with maybe much more abstract ideas in science? That question makes sense.
I'm not sure if, I hear what you're saying, and the development of abstraction in Western art, they've always been very abstract. You could say that all of indigenous art in Australia is abstract. It's a series of dots and marks. It's not trying to do a naturalist drawing of a person. And in many cultures, there have been things which have shifted between decoration to religious ritual to aesthetic pleasure, which are abstract, long before quantum mechanics or theories of that came in. There's certainly an overlap in Western painting between the development of abstraction. But I'm not sure, I was very interested in what Bavesh was saying about surrogates. In other words, what is something that you look at that you're not looking at the world, it's halfway between the world and yourself, a kind of membrane. So it's the world coming towards you. There are things actually happening inside the DNA or inside the cells. and there's some space where it meets it, some piece of information, either a cathode ray tube or an image from an electron microscope. And onto that, you meet it halfway then with all the other experiences, projections, associations, other things you've read that together, and you extract the meaning from that membrane. And that's very much the way it seems to me that we work in the studio, where there is a drawing made, and there's something behind the drawing, some image of the world or some thought of the world, and then the drawing, and that's the world coming towards the sheet of paper, that part, and then the viewer comes from the other side towards it, and that's where the meaning is made, whether it's abstract or whether it is figurative. But the sense of understanding our complicity in making meaning when we're looking at a work of art, that part of it is what comes towards us and part of it is how we respond to it. And I think that, for me, that's interesting what Bavesh was saying about you can't observe the DNA directly. Of course, there are enormous differences. I mean, one of the reliefs of the art world is that there is not peer review in that sense. And of course, the one thing that there also does not have to be in the art world, which would be a real problem if there was, is the reproducibility of experiments. I mean, in this, my sense of the science is one of the ways of testing if the results of an experiment are believable is if you can repeat the experiment and get significantly similar results. Whereas if I've done a drawing and somebody else says, oh, well, my affirmation is to do exactly the same drawing, that somehow doesn't wash. That's not how one wants the... There's a huge space for kind of stupidity in the studio, for going off on a whim and seeing where it leads you, which is much more difficult in science because, as Bavesh was saying, it's about getting grants, it's about carefully planning your research strategy, very carefully formulating a question to try to find an answer. Whereas, I can make a piece of great, so let that be the beginning. Let's see where that leads us. And that's, yeah. So I think there is a kind of a looseness and an openness, and the big question in the end, I think, come back to similar questions of science, but obviously the ways in which we get there are specific to our métier.
And I think there has to be space for that in science too, right, Bavesh? I mean, science, I think, a bit like art, ultimately at its, if you're not too bound to having to get a grant, or in today's contemporary science is very bound by the questions you have to ask. But, there should be the idea of a space to play in the sciences with your ability to measure and observe the world, I think is a huge part of like really good science, is having the freedom. And actually, in the laboratory, you are sort of hiding behind the world, before you publish. There's a lot of room for stupidity, I think, actually, if I remember my days in the laboratory, is, you have to be quite careful about, your moment. You can have some of those quiet moments in the corner there where you ask really dumb questions and you have to throw away 6 months of research. I remember those days quite well. But you have to be, that idea of being able to work and play and make mistakes, I think is also a huge part of, I suppose the mistake is harder to define in the arts than it is in the sciences, maybe. Although we call that serendipity.
So yeah, I mean, Steve, I think I would agree with you. William, I find your comments really intriguing. And when you scribbled on that piece of paper, you shaded out that charcoal image. It got me thinking that, perhaps there is we're experiencing a moment in science now where there is a space for a more whimsical or creative approach. And maybe just follow me here. We've entered what we call the big data era, right? And I'm sure both of you are aware of this. We've sequenced thousands of genomes of organisms. We have so much information on the type of proteins that organisms make. We've got a lot of digital information, and it's captured in so many different digital archives, right? One would question whether we've had a proportional increase in wisdom, right? So we've got all of this information, And, you know, I think the future, the next 10 years in science is how do we interrogate this information? How do you create meaning from this? And perhaps there is a space there for taking a somewhat whimsical approach, right? Because there's so much information there that it would really be hard to say a question is right and a question is wrong, right? It's following what you feel strongly about. And maybe that will lead to creating some meaning from a lot of this data, you know. And I come back to the earlier point, you know, that I think so much of, and it's sort of obscured in the kind of fine tuning of how we do science, but so much of the scientific endeavor is a creative one. It's how you frame your question. It's how you see the world. And you know, William, as you were just describing the membrane, you know, I was about to go back and say, unfortunately, so many times my membrane has shattered. You know, because you start off with one view and you think, okay, through this I can see this, and this is how I think this particular problem is working. And then nature turns around and tells you, no, that's not how it's working, and then the membrane shatters. You know, but it's part of the process. But you know, as William was talking, I remember my daughter once saying to me, because I was trying to describe the scientific, you know, enterprise to her. She was only 6 at the time, and she says to me, "What is it that you do?" And I said, "Well, I do experiments." And she says, "Then what do you do?" So I said, "Well, then I do them again." And this is the beauty of children. And she says, "Why? Did you not do them right the first time?" So I said, no, I did them right the first time. She says, "Why do you have to do them again?" So I said, "Because to show others that I've done it right." She said, "Well, don't they believe you've done it right the first time?" So I said, "Well, that's not the question. I've got to show them I've done it right." She says, "But you said you did it right." You know, so, and I said to her, "Look, this is just how it works." And she walks off and says to my younger son, "I don't think he knows what he's doing." Right? Because any normal person wouldn't do this, right? But she turns to me and says, "What happens if you could become really tiny and then go inside the bacterial cell and see how things work?" And I must admit that terrified me, because what if it was completely different, right? What if everything we've been doing is wrong? Right? So I was like, I'd rather not know. You know, go off and do your homework. You know, but it took me back to that conversation.
Yes, I mean, talking of children and their views of what one does, my younger daughter applied for a scholarship at which you had to write parents' occupation, father's occupation, mother, doctor, that's easy. She said there was no category for artist. So the nearest thing she could find, it was something which was called semi-skilled manual labor. And I said, okay. She said, because it's not like you can fix a watch. You're not a jeweler. You don't have any real skill. Yeah. So I said, okay, I'm quite happy to be a semi-skilled manual laborer, which it is. I mean, it's very much about the body, action.
Do you think it's about convincing people for as long as you possibly can, William? Or do you think you're arriving at some kind of meaning through it all? Because you've got this great quote.
Yeah. I'm not sure if one arrives at one certainly doesn't arrive at a certain meaning. One arrives at a kind of constellation of possible meanings. And it's a bit like a riddle, which has a definite answer or which doesn't have an answer, but which nonetheless intrigues you, and you're at the edge of trying to solve it. Which for me is, there's a polemic in it which has to do about a mistrust of certainty. And of people, whether it's about artistic certainty, political certainty, all of these, of allowing us to understand how much we are involved in that decision of meaning.
Where did that come from in your life, if I may ask, this mistrust of certainty?
Where did it came? I think it partly came from my experience. Firstly, it came from experience of having lawyers for parents and needing to find a way of resisting that legal certainty. That's clear.
Right.
But it also came from my experience of working with a lot of collaborators in different theater and other artistic endeavors, where I understood if I'd hung on to my uncertainty, to half-formed ideas, I'd always cede the ground to people who seemed very certain of what they were arguing. And I thought, well, if they're so certain, they sound so certain, they must be right. And in retrospect, looking back over a number of projects, I realized that no, in fact, if I'd hung on to the uncertainty things I was unsure about, we'd have had a better result at the end. We'd have found our way through. So the studio becomes an important space for allowing doubt and uncertainty to percolate for a long time. In the end, obviously, a decision is made. A drawing is one way or the other. The piece of paper is finished. The frames of the film come to an end and you're committed to that film. But it's allowing, as long as possible, that openness to be there and not feeling you have to get more and more strident of hanging on to a meaning as it gets attacked around you.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that ambiguity, obviously, in the arts is a main currency. As a patient, someone who goes to a doctor, I hate the idea that doctors aren't certain. I want them to be completely certain and completely right. I mean, that's the wish. That's what one always, that's what one hopes for. It's terrifying to hear from a doctor, well, I don't know, maybe A or maybe B. You know, and wants the patient and the doctor to come to an agreement about what the disease is. And I mean, and my wife is a doctor, and she always says two things. She says, well, A, it's important for the doctor and the patient to gather together to agree on the diagnosis. And she also says, and this is as a clinician treating patients the whole time, she also says that an angry patient never gets better if there's a resistance to what's done. So there's a way, even within what one expects to be a very clinical context, the amount of things that aren't quantifiable, that aren't measurable, seem important.
And how do you deal, maybe, Bavesh, with like the you know, because the public, I think, has a certain expectation that the scientist should be right, that the knowledge should be certain. And you know, like, to me, that's where the artist and the scientist maybe can have something to say to each other. But how do you as Bavesh deal with this in your, you know, in your life as a, or how do you feel about deal with that problem or that question?
And I think my own journey in science, Steve, I started off with a very traditional view. You have a hypothesis, and you do research around that hypothesis with the idea that the hypothesis is correct, right? It's very unsatisfying to work on something that you think is going to be wrong. But you know, over the years, as more and more information becomes available, and just going back to my previous comments, now when I look at a problem and I start working on it, the first thing I settle with myself is, am I prepared to be wrong? You know, and you're always wrong about something, right? You're never 100% right about, and you know, the scientists who are listening, and you yourself will know this, you're never 100% right about anything. But I think actually framing what you're right about and framing what you're certain about in the context of the problem at hand is really what creates any kind of meaning from what you can do. But also being very honest and open about what you don't know. So I think that, you know, science constantly struggles with certainty. And, you know, we see that today, you know, the world is looking to the scientists for answers. And where answers can be formulated or are forthcoming, they come out. And when there's a lot we don't know, we say we don't know. We feel it more acutely today because we're dealing with a global pandemic, but that has been the nature of science, and I would even say medicine. You know, there is a time in space when a doctor doesn't know and needs to do more tests and needs to probe more, or just needs to think a little, needs to go back, needs to maybe let the disease percolate so that the truth is more forthcoming. It's very much a combination of science and art. You know, I don't think that I agree with William in one respect, that I'm also very skeptical of scientists who speak in absolutes, because nature is not an absolute. There's constant change. But I mean, I think framing what you know in the context of the problem is the way I do it, Steve. But I do start off saying that I am prepared to be wrong, because if you're not, then you have a very fixed view.
Yeah, it's a simple statement, but it's a very profound statement because it really does shift in how you deal with the world. I wonder if I can just... Oh, sorry, William.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a couple of comments here from the audience. Maybe I just read them. So someone called TB, TB, I get it. One can never see the work through the eyes of the artist, and every work undergoes a process of abstraction in that way. Okay, thank you for that. And Elaine, a message from Elaine Dugan, and I think you're in the UK, Elaine, saw this the other day. What I'm coming to realize as I age is that profundity comes about by letting go. That's a really interesting idea. By not worrying about being meaningful. And Grayson Perry apparently said that. It's a quote from Grayson Perry. So it's about letting go, which is a really interesting idea, is that, you try and hold on to so much information. And I actually, I think that I can relate to that experience. And I think you can relate to that. Maybe, I think all three of us can, because whether it's a drawing, it's what you take out, which makes the drawing make sense. Whether it's a scientific, I remember my working on a scientific problem for 3 years, and then removing 2 years worth of that work, and then it only made sense. Then the narrative came out. It's disheartening because you put a lot of effort in, but sometimes you have to let things go to find the sense in it.
One of my very good friends who used to work at a journal, Nature, said to me, what they really advise a lot of the authors is there's a fair amount that you can't use, kiss it, send it off into the ether, and let it go. Yeah.
It's the biggest lesson. And yeah, William, your work's a lot about erasing. Is that a form of letting go?
It's a form of letting go. Yeah, so the animations are done by, you make a drawing and you erase it and you film it and you erase it and film it and erase it and film it. And there are times when you've got a drawing that you really like, but it's only halfway through the sequence that it needs to go through. And you keep erasing, and yes, it disappears, but sometimes the erased drawing is as interesting as the complete drawing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just reminded of, in terms about certainty, I did a project with Peter Gallison, a great physicist and historian of science. The story of the black hole comes from there. And at one point I said to him, does it worry him that as an artist I'm taking such kind of license with these scientific questions? Mm. And he said, as a physicist, you must understand that mathematicians regard physicists as poets, because their mathematics is always wrong. Physicists' mathematics never stands up to scrutiny from pure mathematicians. And then I read an article about an obituary on a Russian mathematician, and his job, his life's project, had been trying to train a computer to check the mathematical proofs of mathematicians. And they said and sometimes these proofs are so complicated that they take, somebody has to dedicate months or years to going through the proof, checking it. And they said they had not yet found one mathematical of these long proofs, which in fact didn't have some internal mistake in it somewhere. So even what one takes to be the most bedrock certainty, there are these gaps. But having said that, nonetheless, with that mathematics, with the imperfect scientist, practical things are achieved on the earth of a scale that no artist gets anywhere near. So we can't say, oh, the poetry of a physicist or a scientist is the same as theirs certainly works, often works. I mean, we rely on it working in so many, that a drug will actually make you better, and they do.
Yeah. It's a crazy thing, because at the heart of logic, according to Gödel, there is an incompleteness, and it's not that we can't know everything. It's just it's not logically possible to know everything, to know a system completely. So we're always going to have this problem. Quantum physics works really well, but what does it mean? And where does it actually? You can calculate things, but nobody really knows what it actually means. And even scientists there are talking about things like intuition in their calculation. I was speaking to a scientist from UNSW. He says he relies on the intuitive approach to his science. And actually, I was thinking about that, Bavesh, because our science is quite empirical, like, it's DNA, right? And it's got a sequence, and we can see what the sequence encodes, and we can see what we can't necessarily always see what the protein does, but it's quite empirical that way. So it seems to maybe have less room for uncertainty, or maybe intuition. Does that hold true? Do you find intuition?
No, I'm not sure if I agree with you, Steve. I think that there are some things that are quite empirical. There's what we measure and there's what we see. But I think that there's a very thick layer of intuition that you put over that, where you say, okay, these are the measurements, but what do they mean in terms of the biology? And I think your intuition really guides you in terms of how you formulate a hypothesis or a conclusion. It's based on empirical evidence, but there's a lot of intuition that comes with science.
This reminds me of something. It doesn't actually remind. I just wanted to mention it because you had this great idea. You are as a scientist, but one of the things you did several years ago was you organized a TB conference, And then part of that was you gave delegates or members of the public a camera. Is that right? To go photograph TB in the city, to go to what the impressions of the disease was.
Yes, it was more, it was the South African TB conference, and it was in 2014. And what I saw as the world at the time, and I think much of this holds true today, is that the health system seems to be so separated from the day-to-day struggles of people who battle these diseases, the day-to-day struggles of communities that are ravaged by things like TB and HIV. Our health system, and to some extent the work that we do on a daily basis, is so divorced from the human suffering associated with the disease. And I felt like as a scientist, I needed reminding of that. I needed reminding of the patient's voice. I needed reminding of the suffering that goes on behind the day-to-day work that I do in my lab. And so what we did was we took up-and-coming artists, from different communities. We went to the Newtown precinct and communities that were ravaged by TB, and then we gave them cameras and we said, go and we don't want it to be literal, we don't want it to be narrative, we don't want it to be anything. We want it to be what you want it to be. But tell us what this disease has done to you. Tell us what tuberculosis has done to your community. And I promise you, we had these pictures up at the International Convention Center in Durban, and there were people who were in tears in front of some of these pictures, and it was just, for me, the one that really always stuck with me was a little ripped teddy bear that was in a drain, and it was just being washed away, right? And childhood TB is something that has been neglected for a long time because, children don't transmit tuberculosis. They really receive it from adults. And because they're not transmitters of disease, they haven't been focused on. The diagnosis is so poor. We crush up the pills that we use for adults, and we force them down these kids. And it was just I think, and that's where I think that there's a real power to bringing together the human artistic perspective, the human narrative of what goes on in disease, what goes on in the world to the scientist, because it really, those images stay with me. But I always frame my question. I remember that little teddy bear saying, what would I do? What would this work do for those kids? So I think that it leaves a lasting impression, building this sort of bridge between what scientists do and how communities perceive that work.
That's a beautiful, beautiful project. How often, so like William, so there's an example where Bavesh's work directly interacted with the community. Do you find as an artist, the world that is around you or outside of the studio, like you've mentioned ideas, but in terms of the community, the people, how does that influence your art, the work you do?
In different ways. Some years ago, feeling stuck in the studio, even though that is kind of the heart of what I do. I founded a small art center in Johannesburg called the Center for the Less Good Idea, which over the last 3 years, there have been 300 or 400 different artists and theater makers and musicians who've done projects at the center in the heart of downtown Johannesburg. And it was really trying to say the different things that I've seen and how energizing it is to work collaboratively with different people in different fields was something that I really could share with a number of other people. And because artists generally are very tight in their own spaces, and to say, actually, just look at the way it can allow all your work to flower, whether it's a drawing or a dance or whatever, if you have this kind of interaction. And so in that sense, there's a big community involvement, but the community is primarily the community of artists. Within the center itself, there have been lots of projects with different kids groups and old age groups and different things, which different curators and different artists there have wanted to work with. But for me, I see a very strong connection to the community of artists in South Africa, in all the arts, actors, dancers, filmmakers. And the center is kind of the meeting point between what I do in my studio and the outside world. So I think it is. I'm very aware of the historical anomalies of being a white artist, a middle-aged white artist in Johannesburg, with the very particular history that we have, what things have been possible for me and impossible for other people. And the center, it's both the pleasure for me to work with all these people on project, their project, and my project. So it's not just a case of altruism, but it is one other element of what it is to be an artist in Johannesburg at the moment.
And as an artist, and even as a scientist, like maybe we should talk a little bit about like specifically COVID, given its obvious profound change, I think, that it's having on our society. How do you, Bavesh, as a scientist, frame how we can, like, the effect it's had on us as a, as a people? And I'd love to hear then how an artist would respond to that, if there is a response you can have, other than, what the awareness around that might be.
Steve, I think COVID has turned the world upside down, right? That's a very simple way of putting it, but I think it's shaken us to our very core. It's shown how fragile so many of the things we thought that were firmly bedded into our society are, how fragile our health systems are, how fragile our political systems are, how fragile the economy is. And I mean, whilst we, always had this as a narrative in our daily life, I think having to experience it, I don't think there's a single person who can say that they haven't been touched in some way, either economically, directly by the disease, losing a friend, having their communities affected. I think it's turned the world upside down. As a scientist, we very quickly pivoted everything we were doing on tuberculosis towards COVID, because we felt that this is what we do. Science is service to humanity, and this was an opportunity to do that. And there are thousands of people out there who've done the same thing. But I think that, as a scientist, it was very difficult. One had to ask really difficult questions. You had people dying. Is there something you could do to help? But I think generally as a society, and I think it's forced us to really look at ourselves, right? We've had things that we've not experienced before. We were all confined to our homes. We were all confined to small spaces. We were all, our social movement was restricted. We willingly gave up social liberties, and civil liberties. The world has been so jarred. And I was listening to the radio this week, and the DJ was saying that she's absolutely astounded at the depth and emotive quality of music coming out of South African artists, right? And she attributes that directly to COVID in South Africa, to the lockdown, to economic hardship, to losing loved ones. And she says she's been DJing for so long, but you can see, it's almost palpable. You can reach out and touch it, this change you feel in society. I'm looking forward to seeing how that's going to manifest as art, different forms of art. But I think that, there's no normal, I think you've heard this, there's no normal going on from this, but COVID has really, really changed things.
Yeah. William, how's?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, working, as I said, mainly in the studio, the studio is in the garden of my house. So there's a paradox that from a personal point of view, to have had 6 months uninterruptedly in my studio every day has felt like a huge blessing. All the exhibitions and performance projects have either been cancelled or delayed. And for me personally, that's been a chance to work, but I'm completely aware with all the people I work with, musicians, dancers, actors, how their ability just even to ply their trade, to practice their métier has come to a complete halt for these 6 months, and it's been devastating. And not just financially certainly, but also in terms of energy, motivation. All of these things have to be rebuilt from a really low base from that break. So that's a really hard one that we're dealing with at the center, with all the other people dealing with it. We went through a COVID storm at the studio where many people associated and working with the studio were infected at the height of our infection, just when we thought it was possible to start filming again and doing things together. So there was a huge anxiety about the illness of everyone. One person was very ill, but fortunately, all 13 of us recovered. And so we're all back fine. And in that sense, we all feel we're kind of at the other side of the lake. We've gone through that storm. And for the moment, certainly for the next extended period, we can't give it to anyone, no one can give it to us. And we're a kind of a COVID-safe bubble in the studio. So, but it's again the anomaly of this in the context of what's happening all around, and the devastation to so many lives economically, more economically even than health-wise. One has a sense the effects are going to be felt. The number of people you see on the streets in Johannesburg who are destitute, the blank spaces in areas where before there would have been commerce, are very, very palpable here. During this last 6 months, I've had a granddaughter born. My father's getting very old in London, and so there's a real sense that I want to be able also to get out of the studio to do things that I would have done a year ago, 7 months ago. And I think, but as an artist, it's going to take a while to see how it sediments into the work. There's some pointers of what's happening now that come into the drawings, very specific references, but the larger sense of premature mortality, of risk, do we go towards our fate? Can we avoid our fate? Those kinds of questions have been there in the work before and continue, but I'm sure are shaped also by this last year's experience.
Right, yeah, thank you for that. Look, we're going to have to draw it to a close now, but there's one more question I really want to ask you before we go, and I hope it's an intelligent question. My old professor used to say to me, he just wants a semi-intelligent question from me, and I'm not sure how often I gave him one, but that question is, what do you think came first, art or science in the human story? What came first?
I mean, I would imagine science. I would imagine that a stone was shaped into a weapon or a flint before the first person was drawing on the cave with charcoal, or a flint and nail to make a flame. That would be. But I think they're both coeval with very early humanity.
Bavesh?
So I was actually going to say art, because and in fact, William, I thought of the same example. And I would say that the idea was born in the person's mind to create something artistic, and then the person used science to create an embodiment of that artistic image or perception that was born. So I would say the idea of art was born first, and that was followed by science.
So the idea, and then the how do we tame the idea into something that we can use?
Manifest.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Well, it's 9 o'clock here in Australia. It's 1 o'clock there in South Africa, and I just want to say that I'm so grateful to you both for doing this, taking of your time. And for me, it was just a wonderful experience, because I've always been a deep admirer of yours, William. In fact, it's hard to pick up a piece of charcoal anymore without, the mental attribution of William Kentridge coming into your hand. So I've tried to avoid it for a while. And Bavesh, you are a colleague and friend that I've always had deep admiration for, always the best dressed in town, and great wisdom, both of you. So to have the two of you in the same forum, I just think is a beautiful thing. It's an encounter between these two idea worlds that I really hope happens more. And I think there is a lot, and I hope that we could see from today's conversation that there's a lot that we can say to each other. And let's drink coffee together, when this crisis averts and finds its place. So I just really want to thank you both for joining us, and to everyone out there for attending. Thank you so much for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I really appreciate your presence here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bavesh. Thank you, Steven.
Thank you, William.
Thank you.
Be nice to meet you at some stage.
Yes, be lovely. Right here, we're probably close to each other here in the city.
Take care.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.